Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Rosa Cabrera, Director of the UIC Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in our Climates of Inequality online conversation series with local environmental and climate justice leaders. I would like to do a quick access check. Is our audio okay for everyone? Please let us know maybe with a thumbs up or a reaction button. Okay. Also, let us know if you are able to access the caption option on Zoom. If you have any questions about accessibility during our program, please chat us and one of the LCC staff will help you through that process. Okay, so a little bit about the Climates of Inequality series. These are 7 online presentations being organized for this fall, where guest speakers will be highlighting how frontline communities in the Chicago region are impacted by environmental pollution and climate change, and more recently by COVID-19, and how they are demanding justice and putting forward a vision to create healthier and safer communities. Environmental justice champions have been at work for decades now, dealing with the hardship of environmental pollution and seeking government action to correct and prevent further harm that largely burdens Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color. A new generation of champions is rising up with enormous clarity, outlining transformative solutions to correct the violence of environmental degradation and create a path to rectify economic inequity and defeat the climate crisis. So today's presentation will offer an insight on how this is happening through the tactics of grassroots organizing led by the Sunrise Movement. They have a clear message. The climate crisis is here, and the Green New Deal is our last best hope for a livable future. Winning big changes like the Green New Deal, they say, requires a movement of movements. And what they mean by this, that the climate crisis movement needs to be intertwined with the movement for Black life and other liberations movements. So before we start the presentation, a few thank yous, starting with our partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where the Climates of Inequality Traveling Exhibition Project resides, and organizations Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization known as Alvejo. They have been our collaborators to create a local story, Resisting Cycles of Environmental Injustice in La Villita, which you can check out in the LCC website. I believe that the link has been shared on that chat now. I've been saying that it has, great. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, the Department of Anthropology, Las Ganas Program, Latin American and Latino Studies, Latin American Recruitment and Educational Services, known as LARES, Museums and Exhibition Studies, the School of Art and Art History, and we have a few UIC student organizations, which is great. Alpha Psi Lambda Zeta Chapter, Hope for the Day, Latinx Graduate Student Association, Roosevelt Network, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Union for Puerto Rican Students. I'm also thanking the students panelists in my environmental and climate justice class. They are Olga Delgado Cano, Will Marie Medina Cortez, and Carlos Reina. The presentation will be about 35 minutes long, followed by a short Q&A kind of conversation format between these students and the presenter. Now I'm introducing our guest speaker. Ian Zeitlan works for Sunrise Movement Chicago, co-coordinating a team that designs discussion spaces for hub members on the spectrum of whiteness to learning about Black history. Ian is a graduate of Quinnipiac University with a BA in Public Relations. Welcome to our virtual community, Ian.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. I'm gonna share this screen. I'll give you fair warning. Sometimes when I share my screen, my computer gets a little afraid of what's happening, but it seems like we're good. Lovely. All right. I am just gonna re-pull up the chat so I can make sure that I can see what's happening. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in there, and I will try to pay attention to that as I'm talking. But thank you so much again for having me. I'm Ian. I'm part of the Sunrise Movement. I'm a volunteer, co-coordinator on a team under the trainings team, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the Sunrise Movement and about the Green New Deal. So just getting right into it, the Green New Deal, so we can really get on the same page, is a resolution introduced by Senator or Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey. It's aspirational. It's not a piece of legislation that means that the government has to do these specific things, but it's kind of a guideline for kind of a slate of future legislation that will take us into kind of a just future. It was introduced in February 2019. The Green New Deal is striving towards 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030, a job guarantee for every American who needs one, investments prioritizing frontline communities, an overhaul of transportation, infrastructure, agricultural systems in order to in order to guarantee everyone clean water and air and healthy food to eat, along with Medicare for all and much more. Now, with the Green New Deal, there was a piece of information of a call to action put out by the Red Nation, an indigenous activist organization called the Red Deal. It wasn't put out instead of the Green New Deal, it was put out as kind of a companion document so that they can kind of work together to make sure that frontline and indigenous communities are being prioritized in this future that is being created under the Green New Deal. The 10-point program from the Red Nation calls for the reinstatement of treaty rights, the full rights and equal protection of Native people, the end to disciplinary violence against Native peoples and all oppressed peoples, the end to discrimination against the Native silent majority, which is youth and the poor, the end to the discrimination, persecution, killing, torture, and rape of Native women, the end to the discrimination, persecution, killing, torture, and rape of Native lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit people, the end to the dehumanization of the Native peoples, access to appropriate education, healthcare, social services, employment, and housing, the representation or repatriation of Native lands and lives, and the protection of non-human relatives, and the end to colonialism and capitalism. I really like that last one because to me, all of the other ones are quite long, and this one is very short, but it's like calling for this giant, massive change. I just like the little bit of irony in that. But really where I think you get to see the Red Deal as a companion document to the Green New Deal is in their areas of struggle, because all of these things that they're talking about in these areas really touch on parts of the Green New Deal that people are asking for in that document. And the areas of struggle are the end to the occupation, a divestment from an abolishment of police and military institutions. So when the Green New Deal is calling for safe communities for everyone, there are communities that feel unsafe around the police or with the military, of course, because of the ways that they've brutalized communities and oppressed them for pretty much the entirety of US history. It's calling for a healing of our bodies with a reinvestment in institutions that provide housing, healthcare, and education for all. And this really goes hand in hand with the defund the police movement, along with the movement for Black lives that's happening right now. We can't really, but a lot of these services that we'd be able to provide, a lot of the budget is eaten up by the police. So in order to reinvest in these institutions, we need to take the money back from places that are causing harm. And we need to heal our planet by creating jobs by reinvesting in sustainable energy, protection and restoration of sacred sites, and land, water, and animal restoration. So when the Green New Deal is calling for jobs for all, these are the jobs that we're going to have. These are massive reinvestments in our transportation, in our infrastructure, in the well-being of the earth that we literally walk on in this country. So I think where the Green New Deal can be a little bit misconstrued is that it's this big piece of resolution legislation that's calling for massive change, but it's kind of hard to see what that looks like in a tangible sense. So now, actually, instead of playing this on Zoom, we're gonna just take a moment, and the link for this video should be dropped in the chat. And I just want us to all kind of go on mute and watch this for the next 7.5 or so minutes, and we'll come back just so it doesn't kind of skip and jump around if my Wi-Fi goes out. So we'll come back at about 4:48, 49 once we've finished watching this. And feel free to drop any reactions that you have to the video in the chat. It'd be nice to hear from folks. Right, I'm gonna take these few reactions as kind of a thought that we're all kind of finished up with the video. I think what was really moving for me about this, I mean, this now a little over a year ago, I think now, but just seeing the ways that our imagination can really propel us into a different direction than we've been heading, and really push us towards a future that does work for everybody, and that is a possibility, and that people in Congress, in our government, are thinking that way, at least a very small few of them. But I think that really has been, in the few months that I've been a part of Sunrise, some of the incredible power that organizing does have is the power of imagining and envisioning and looking forward in a way that says, what do we want to create and how can we get there? So that brings us to talking about what Sunrise is all about. We're all about climate justice. And when we're talking about climate justice, we're talking about fighting against climate change, of course. I mean, we have rising temperatures with increased wildfires in the West, hurricanes happening in the South and Southeast, and tornadoes in the Midwest at rates that we haven't seen before. But when we're talking about climate justice, we're also talking about local issues. We're talking about the Hilco demolition in Little Village a few months ago during a respiratory pandemic, sending up a massive cloud of dust. We're talking about the now approved move of General Iron from Lincoln Park into the East Side neighborhood in South Chicago. Climate change is important and we're fighting against that, but we also need to take into account the things that are affecting the people here right now. So I think it's important to get a little bit of context on environmental organizing and kind of what it's been, where it's come from, and how we kind of got to this moment. So starting in the 70s here, we have large nonprofit environmental organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth who are fighting against acid rain. This was a huge fight of the moment that took about 20 years to get the government to legislate a change in the way that SO2 was created, or that electrical plants couldn't create as much SO2, sulfur dioxide, which created acid rain. And these groups lobbied DC politicians. They lined up scientists to testify that acid rain is harmful to forests, lakes, and rivers. It would essentially break down any living matter to the point where if you were on a lake or a river where there was lots of acid rain, you could see straight to the bottom because there was nothing growing. But I think it's also important to note what they didn't do. They didn't go to neighborhoods of color or poor communities who are experiencing heightened rates of acid rain. They didn't build a massive movement of people affected to advocate for themselves, and they didn't build alliances at the grassroots level. They really focused on animals and nature, which of course is very important and is a part of the earth that we live on. But when you are having poorer and communities of color having heightened rates of acid rain, creating chronic bronchitis and other respiratory diseases, I think that you're really leaving out the people who are affected by this, which are just as much a part of this fight as the nature and animals that maybe sold a little bit better in the public image. This takes us to climate change. The same environmental organizations took up the fight against climate change, while local groups, indigenous nations, and farmers were already in the fight. But on a national scale, it was the environmental groups that had the biggest microphones. And they used images like this polar bear on a melting piece of ice caps falling into the sea and ocean. And they used slogans like Save the Planet, which spoke to people in the white middle class environmental movement. It's sensible to use what has worked in the past, but on climate change, the strategy hasn't worked because they're really leaving out people. And I think to build this massive thing for change, we need people power. And I think that is where I feel Sunrise comes in and sees kind of the broader picture of how we can create that change. So we're building a better strategy, at least we hope. We need a strategy that fights against the phenomenal power of fossil fuel industry has over our politicians and every facet of our way of life. We need a strategy that builds towards large-scale mass movement, including all walks of life, and fights against racism and classism, which keeps historically marginalized communities from leading movements and seeing their concerns echoed in movement demands. And I think where this really shows up for me is collective liberation and the idea that we are all free. I think since joining Sunrise back in April, I've done a lot of looking and researching into past movements to see where successes have been had, where they have lost. And I think it feels very evident that in order to get something by pushing someone else down is not necessarily the right way to go about it. I think that we need to be unwavering in our support for all movements of liberation. And I really like this quote from the Red Nation, which is a part of the Red New Deal. Thus, the Red Deal is red because it prioritizes indigenous liberation on one hand and a revolutionary left position on the other. It is simultaneously particular and universal because indigenous liberation is for everybody. And I think the idea that indigenous liberation is for everybody is so necessary for us to be able to have the success in the efforts that we're pushing for. In watching the Hong Kong protests over the past year and a half, what has felt really powerful in their ability to keep this very prolonged protest going is the solidarity that they have. There's kind of a rule amongst the protesters that nobody from any group or way of participating or tactics says anything negative about any other group of people. If you are a strictly nonviolent protester, then that's great. If you are protesting from home, then that's great. If you're in direct action and conflict with the police, that's great as well. And I think it's that feeling of solidarity that's allowed for the protest to continue in such high numbers for such a long time. So a few Sunrise principles that I think really build out from this are that we take initiative. Any 3 people in Sunrise can do what they want. You don't need to have anybody's approval. There's no bureaucracy within this group of people. I mean, it's people that are about 12 all the way up until 30. So there's really not a checks and balances of what you can and can't do. You have to ask this person. And I think that really allows for us to have a lot of excitement about the work that we're doing because it's the work that we want to do. And there's a lot of ways to get involved, really kind of across the board in different hubs. So in Chicago, we have a very large hub. You can get involved in policy, in trainings, in recruitment, in direct action. And there's really a place for whatever you want to bring your passion to within the movement. We embrace experimentation and we learn together. And I think that this really ties in with the idea of us taking initiative. It allows for someone to say, hey, I don't really know what to do here, but here's what I feel like I can bring to the table. It allows people to really run with that. And I think that that's created a lot of really incredible things. In Chicago alone, we have a member named Andrea, and she created this now national part of Sunrise called La Escuelita, which is kind of putting a lot of the trainings that we have into Spanish to build power by Latinx people for Latinx people. And at the same time, we stand for movements for change with other movements for change. Seeing the ways that the local hub has really gotten involved in the movement for Black lives before the George Floyd protests and since then, it's been really inspiring to feel like this is a group that I want to be a part of. The environmental movement does not always speak to me. I think that it, like I said earlier, can skew really white and middle class. And I don't think that that is the way that we need to be working. I think that environmental justice has to do with racism more than it has to do with anything else. And if we're not willing to stand with movements for change, then I don't really know what we're doing. And this has allowed for a massive amount of growth. We have 400 plus local hubs all over the country. And there's an appreciation of difference between the hubs. I mean, Chicago is huge, but if you have a hub in the middle of somewhere in Ohio, it's not as big. They're doing different things. They have different tactics. And I think that's kind of the idea of the solidarity in the ways that you're acting, and the ways that you are interacting with this movement. And it's allowed, like I said, for people to bring passion to their work. But why does this matter? Like, I'm talking about passion a lot. I know, I have practiced this, and it's like, wow, you really talk about passion a lot. But I think this matters in kind of the creation of a sustained movement. And I think to be able to see that a little bit more clearly, we should take a look back in time. We're going to play a game called Guess Who This Very Stressed Out Man Is. So feel free to drop in the chat if you have any guesses. And I will wait until someone guesses. Yes, it's LBJ. Why was LBJ so stressed out? I would say it's because prior to passing the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, LBJ was a staunch segregationist. He was put on the JFK ticket to win the Southern states and the Southern racist Democrats. He was not in support of civil rights. That wasn't why he was there. He was pretty against it his entire life. But he was up against the civil rights movement, which had been going on for about 2 decades at that time, with consistent participation. I mean, the Montgomery boycott or bus boycott lasted 380 days in a row. Every single Black resident in Montgomery didn't use the buses during that boycott for over a year, and they worked together to get people around. And why this consistent participation really matters is in relation to the link that was dropped in the chat about the 3.5% rule. There was a Harvard professor who researched every single protest or revolution movement since, I believe, 1600, all the way up until now. And she found that nonviolent movements had about 50% higher success than violent movements. But what I found really interesting about this research is that she found that if a group is able to achieve 3.5% of the population with active and consistent participation, they have never lost once. And the only groups that have been able to reach that point have been nonviolent groups. In the US, it's about 11 million people. So feel free to go out and tell your neighbors that we need to do something, because we're definitely not there yet. But I think what that allows for is for us to create a growing movement full of passionate people who see the power of collective liberation. And if we're able to do that, we're able to have massive success. In about 1.5 to 2 years, Sunrise has really kind of stormed onto this playing field in electoral politics in endorsing Green New Deal champions like Marie Newman in the Illinois 3rd. She unseated in the primaries Dan Lipinski, who was one of the most right-leaning Democrats left in all of Congress. He was the only Democrat left who was still pro-abortion. And she is endorsed along with a slew of other Green New Deal champions who are really here for progressive policies like Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, and oh no, I'm blanking on the fourth one. Those three people who are lovely. So if you have any interest in getting involved a little bit more, you can check out our Get Involved page at this link, join the Chicago Hub Slack and introduce yourself. At the second link, someone will definitely reach out to you very excitedly from the recruitment team, or join on Somos Sunrise, which is a new effort that was kind of created out of this idea from Andrea to have really kind of a specific place for Latinx people, by Latinx people within Sunrise, pushing for the Green New Deal. And they haven't exactly planned out everything that they're doing yet, but I am very excited to see what they do because Andrea is really fantastic. And then finally, we won't watch this here. You can watch this on your own, but there's a kind of follow-up video to the one that we watched that just was released that really takes us from this point in COVID to the future of where the Green New Deal can head. And I think that for me, seeing that right now in this time of a lot of uncertainty has felt really exciting and empowering, and makes it feel like this efforts that we're doing right now can pay off, and we can win, and we have to win. But that is really all I have as far as the presentation. Thank you so much for listening to my voice. It's kind of weird not being able to see all of your faces, but I'm sure you're all lovely. And I'm so excited to answer some questions.
Thank you, Ian, for that really interactive presentation. I really like those features. It's really engaging.
I'm so glad.
I had a question to start off with, and this is more specifically for the video, a message from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Do you know of any other current Green New Deal legislation that's in the works?
That's a really good question. I don't know of any that is specifically tied to the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is still has not passed. I think it's, I don't know, it's maybe like 10 legislators away from being able to pass, but is endorsed by the general progressive candidates that you would expect. I would say personally that I would count the ban Black abolitionist networks call for the defundment of the Chicago police by 75% to fall, in my opinion, under things that you could consider kind of a part of the Green New Deal. But on a national level, I don't have any policy off the top of my head.
No worries, thank you, that's helpful.
Hi, Ian. I was wondering if there was any labor movements, either past or present, that inspired you, and what are some of the major hurdles that you see in organizing labor?
Yeah, I think, so I'm from Philadelphia, and my dad is a school psychologist, so he's worked in the school district of Philadelphia for my whole life. And seeing his very light involvement in the union there, and then moving to Chicago and seeing the really stark difference in the ways that labor unions really work in Chicago versus Philadelphia, especially the teachers union. There's definitely a lot more bite to the CTU than the Philly union. And it's specifically been kind of held back by the state in Philly. There was a long time that I think it was illegal for the teachers unions to strike at all, which feels unconstitutional to me in some way. Not a constitutional lawyer, so I don't really know, but feels like maybe not a thing. But I think as far as labor movements that have inspired me, I honestly need to do a little bit more reading about labor movements. I know a little bit about the Haymarket protests, but I think where my knowledge really lies in terms of past movements is movements for racial justice. and moments in history that we've kind of forgotten or forgotten on purpose that really, to me, are really powerful and have a lot of ties to where we are right now.
Thanks for sharing that, Ian.
Yeah, sure. Also, if anyone who's not a panelist has a question to drop in the chat, I'll answer anything. I really like the Q&A a lot more than the presentation. It's more fun. Down to have a conversation.
Well, then I guess what brought you, did you mention what brought you to Sunrise Movement? Or like what inspired you to journey?
I didn't, but so in March or April, I was furloughed from my job and had been following Sunrise for a while. They kind of started up around when the Green New Deal came out, and what really kind of propelled them to kind of a national stage were these sit-ins across the country, and most notably in Nancy Pelosi's office, where AOC joined in. And so from then, I'd kind of just like known about them, been interested in the work they're doing, felt excited to see young people, and like actually really young people, so involved and feel so empowered. And then as I was furloughed, they started advertising a little online training called Sunrise School that gave a little bit of the history and ideas behind the work that we're doing. And I just had a lot of time and wanted to like do something. And it's been really exciting. I think the power that I feel Sunrise has is in your ability to really bring what you want to it. And people are so excited in your first meeting for you to say whatever you want, whatever you think needs to change. Like, and that's not really how a lot of organizations, especially organizing organizations, seem to work in my experience. So being able to be on the call to kind of figure out what we want to do when the George Floyd protests start happening, and me saying like, we understand as a hub and as an environmental movement, it is still majority white, and we are very much talking about that and working to change that, especially in Sunrise and especially in the Chicago hub. So in that moment, I was really unsure of what other white hub members knew about anti-Blackness, about the kind of history outside of what we get taught in our primary school education. And from that created this group to essentially find these moments in history that we want to call more attention to and have discussion space around them, but really keep it interactive even more so than this presentation, because I don't like talking at people that much. And keep it really interactive so that there is space for people to kind of talk about, analyze, and unlearn some of the racism that we kind of hold inside of us as we're complicit in the system. And just the fact that there's room for you to really bring what you want to it and make a lot of change within an organization is just really exciting to see.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that really differs, I think, from a lot of organizations we might all be familiar with, which are really top down. So seeing like a bottom up structure is really great, refreshing, and it just shows how much the organization is willing to grow and change with whatever the community wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Levels of involvement. Yeah. I volunteer, and most of the people involved are volunteers in various ways. There are some full-time staff, but it's not even set up where full-time staff are all kind of at this national top level. A lot of the people that are in national are actually not full-time staff, they're totally volunteers. So it's really kind of scattered throughout who is like paid staff and who is a volunteer. And I think what's really interesting to me is that if you do apply to be full-time staff, it's not, you don't get paid based off your experience or whatever level of position you would be at. They say, what is your need? And they really allow you to name that with no questions asked. And seeing that in a job application alone is really interesting and really kind of exciting as a new way to kind of go about that.
Ian, I have a question. I'm just curious, what is the take from Sunrise in the Green New Deal not being explicit in calling for phasing out oil, gas, and coal? What do you think? Was that a strategy from the legislation not to put that in the writing? I mean, I know there has been a lot of questions around that, and I believe that when you show us the tenets of the Red Deal, I mean, that's one of the things that they call out, that we have to make sure that that's takes from stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely can't speak for all of Sunrise. I can speak for me, but I think that in the writing of the Green New Deal, I definitely kind of agree that it looks like there's some places that they kind of wrote a little bit more politically than kind of front and center. And I think that that is why I really like, when I'm talking about the Green New Deal, to talk a little bit more about the Red Deal, because it says the things that need to happen really more upfront, because it's not a political document in the same sense that the Green New Deal is. But I think where the Green New Deal differs from Sunrise is really that Sunrise, to me, falls a lot more in line with the kind of calls from the Red Deal. There's no mincing of words around fossil fuels and the need to get rid of fossil fuel millionaires and billionaires. That is really how, at least from like the national stuff that I read and look at in terms of training, that's really how they talk about it. Talking about it really less even so as the fossil fuel industry and more as the fossil fuel billionaires that are really kind of using their money to make these systems happen in the way that they are. There's actually a lot of care, I think, in the ways that Sunrise and the Green New Deal talks about people who work in the fossil fuel industry. I mean, there's a massive need for these people who have jobs like regular people to be able to transition into green jobs so that they can be a part of this just future as they move away from an industry that is kind of leaving them behind when they're done with them, like in coal towns.
I feel like this is a long shot, but I'm assuming there's no like fossil fuel company out there that's like also backing up the Green New Deal, right? Or like agreeing with any of its tenants, right?
Not that I know of.
Right?
No. Yeah. I think it's there's one of the trainings that National has kind of put forth for us to do. I end up kind of making my own, but from what they give out, there's like this big section on all of these fossil fuel lobbyists fueling this like fear that we're not going to be able to eat beef anymore. But that's what the Green New Deal is about. It's no more beef. They can't take away our beef. It's all about being able to eat our burgers and steaks, which is like great. Like if you want those, awesome. But that is, there's definitely not a lot of effort to find a compromise coming from the fossil fuel billionaires. And I don't think there would be a lot of effort to find a compromise coming from Sunrise either, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting how like the fear mongering is also sometimes more powerful than just like positive facts.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's been interesting to see the ways that Sunrise is working to there's an understanding that like we could give facts all day, and there's just a large group of the population that has literally no interest in that. And even like a larger group of the population that just doesn't have interest in talking about it or engaging with the conversation. They're not necessarily for or against it, but it's just not what they care to talk about. And I think the messaging around the Green New Deal has been a lot less heavy on these facts of it because of that reason. I think that we need to be looking towards the future with hope in creating these jobs for the future, for a just future, rather than saying we need to get the emissions down by 2030. Like, do I know that? Do I want to talk about that? Yes, absolutely. But does everyday people care about that? Not as much. And I think that the power behind the Green New Deal is really being able to talk about this kind of beautiful future that it could create, where we do all kind of have an opportunity to live dignified lives and to work if we would like to, and be supported if we are have different abilities and disabilities.
Hey, Ian, there's actually a question in the chat from a student, and I think they're asking, what do they mean when the Green New Deal is non-binding? Many readings explain that the resolution is non-binding, so even if Congress approves it, nothing in the proposal would become law. How is this possible, or what does that mean?
Yeah, so the Green New Deal is not actually a law, it's a resolution. So it's a way that Congress can say, we resolve to make these things happen. That's kind of like the formal way of how they say it. But it's kind of a designation of intent. And so passing the Green New Deal would be saying, we intend to make these things happen. But if you actually read the Green New Deal, which I would recommend, it's actually not the worst read. It's only 14 pages, which sounds really long, but I promise you most lines are like one sentence. The way bills are written, it's all kind of easier. It's like a quick read, like honestly about 15 minutes. But if you read through it, there's not like, this needs to happen with this governmental organization, and here's the exact specifics of it. But it's really kind of painting this broad structure of how we want to shift our economy and society into this kind of green future. Yeah, definitely.
Ian, I actually had a question for you. So at the Latino Cultural Center, we've been having a lot of conversations about environmental justice and climate change, and how that intersection looks right now as everyone is going through the pandemic. But of course, we understand that everyone is experiencing COVID-19 in different ways. And I also know that you mentioned the Somos Sunrise, which is the Latinx community version support of Sunrise. And so I'm wondering how Sunrise is having those conversations right now as we are experiencing the pandemic.
Sure. You broke up in the middle, so I just want to kind of reiterate what you said to make sure that I got it. The question was kind of, with this pandemic happening, the environmental justice is not necessarily at the forefront. How do we kind of balancing that? Is that?
I didn't, but that actually sounds great. So yes, I'm just actually curious. I'm curious just to know how y'all are addressing the pandemic and having these conversations, like the whole intersection with the work that y'all do with COVID-19.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, definitely the actions that we did at the very beginning of COVID was kind of when I was joining on. So they were all wildly socially distant, like take a picture outside of your house, social distanced. We have had one protest since COVID, and they're really, it's been pretty exciting to see the ways that people are comfortable wearing masks and being social distance at a protest and actually following these ways of living. My partner is immunocompromised, so I really have to be extra safe. And being able to attend those protests has still been really, it just feels really necessary. But I think for me, in thinking about the Green New Deal and climate justice with COVID, this pandemic is really kind of a multiplier of the intensity of all of this, as is climate change and these issues with climate justice. So I don't think that this pandemic is necessarily going to be our last. And we're seeing that with climate change happening and global warming happening, there's more opportunity for pandemics. And so as we get further down this line towards a place where we cannot turn back, which is now somewhere between 7 and 8 years. I know the video said 12, but we are running as fast as we can. As we get further down that line before we can turn back, these things are only going to get more intense. We're only going to get bigger wildfires in the West. We're only going to get stronger hurricanes hitting our south and southeast. And we're going to have to fight all of these off while we have more intense pandemics happening. So I think up until this year, a pandemic has not been on many people's radar, and climate change has, but only so much, because it is far out. It's not like if we don't do something today, we're all just gonna like disappear. It's that at that 10-year mark, we just can't go back, and things will get worse and worse and worse past a point of us realizing there's a chance that I think from last year, about 14 years from now, Manhattan could be underwater if we kind of continue along the ways that we're going. So imagine all of these crises, plus the intensity that a pandemic puts on people's lives, on people's ability to remain housed, to remain employed. And without the government supporting people in these moments, like the Green New Deal is asking for them to, I just don't know what we'll be able to do. I'm really afraid for that direction of the future, but I feel like when we come together, we really have the ability to turn it back. If you watch the message from the future part 2, it does talk about kind of the ways that COVID and more pandemics will really intersect with the issues brought up from climate change. So I would definitely recommend that watch. Yeah, it's really interesting and scary, but good, exciting.
From another question, Ian. When, and notice that I'm saying when, not if, when the Green New Deal passes, how do you see this unfolding to move it from an aspirational document to action?
Yeah.
And what can we do at a local level to prepare for that?
Yeah, I, since getting involved in Sunrise, have thought like a lot about the ways that power and politics seem to work and interplay together. And we really are taught, or at least I was taught through kind of the small amount of civic education I got, is that what matters most is the president. And if you vote for the president and sometimes the senators and the under ticket stuff, that's fine. But I think power doesn't really work that way. Power isn't top down unless you have a ton of money. Power is bottom up, it's from the middle. And I think that when we are able to work to build from the bottom and from the middle, that is where real power lies. And it lies in the ability to push for legislation, for people who are in Congress pushing for the legislation we want. And I think when there's enough power to pass the Green New Deal, that'll mean that there's enough power to be able to keep on these legislators, these local legislators, both at a very local level and at a national kind of more local level, to continue passing these legislations that we need to have the Green New Deal. So I couldn't necessarily say what that first piece of really concrete legislational change is, but a lot of the things from the Green New Deal have been pushed onto Biden's platform. I'm not a big fan of Biden. I certainly will be voting for him. But the reason that those are on there is because of the kind of political power that Sunrise has been able to build. And one of the founders of Sunrise was on the Biden Sanders task force that kind of built that plan. We were able to pull Biden's climate plan 20 years back from 2050 to 2030 on zero carbon emissions, which is like a massive change. And to think that there has been enough power built in about 2 years to get to the national stage and influence the platform of the president, I think that that really shows that the power of bottom-up organizing and organizing on a local level is really how you make that change. So of course, we're having this influence on a national scale with congresspeople and potentially the presidential platform. But if we apply this power to a local level, it could have such an outsized effect. The amount of people that vote in Chicago for the mayor is like so little. Like it's really kind of scary how few people really vote for alder people, for the mayor, for these smaller elected positions, and they have the most impact in our daily life. So if we really come together and push for a mayor that has everyone's best interest at heart and is willing to listen to activists and makes that clear, then we could have a massive amount of change on our hands at a local level with much less of an effort that we would have to do to create that change just at a national level. And I think that that's where it builds from. If we're able to create that big change here, that builds in other cities. And when those cities come together, that's how a national mass movement actually happens, is that it starts from that local level and then gets kind of pushed up. That's a really good question. I'm totally with you. I like fully agree. I think that BLM is very in line with a lot of the things that the Green New Deal is about and Sunrise stands for. I couldn't say necessarily if there's going to be like collaboration in terms of advocacy, but I think honestly, some of the power is that groups are separate because we're reaching different populations. We're not trying to kind of push everyone into one organization to have one specific voice, because I think that that is really where we've seen some of the failures of the past. When people talk about the civil rights movement, they say Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And when those leaders were murdered, there wasn't as much there to go off because those leaders were not as invested in really just giving the power to the people. I think the person that I found most interesting researching from the civil rights movement is Ella Baker. She was there in this SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Council, which was Martin Luther King's organization. And she really challenged these very charismatic leaders to let go of power at the top and give it to the people on the ground. She was influential in starting SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which went on to kind of spur into the Black Panthers. And I think that her commitment throughout all of this to make sure that the people had the most power is really where you saw a lot of these groups have the most lasting ability and effect in local communities.
I guess, Ian, one more question if I can. You mentioned that we were able, or Sunrise was able to help scale down the timeline 20 years for some of these changes. Was it as simple as just saying, hey, you have to do this faster, or were there a little bit more specifics to that as like examples?
I definitely don't know.
Okay.
It was like there was a representative from Sunrise, one of the founders, who was put there in the side from the Sanders team on the climate task force, and that was like closed meetings that I definitely don't know anything about. I also don't really know like all of how everything works at the national level. I'm really a lot more focused in Chicago because I think like I just only have so much capacity. And interest in doing more national stuff. I think that there's kind of a little bit more of a spark and magic that I've found in doing more organizing on a local level and pushing it to a national level. Like personally, you really have to kind of get into some of the numbers of it, and I'm not as much of a numbers person. I like people a lot more. But I think, yeah, it's really that there was enough power for Sanders to see the Sunrise movement as the people to represent climate change and climate justice, and enough power behind that to say to a potential president-elect, we have enough people in this movement who will not vote for you if you don't do this. We're very rarely appealing to leaders who are on the same page as us, because if they were, we wouldn't really be appealing to them. And I think that that's a similar case with LBJ and the civil rights movement. I mean, he had to do this kind of political calculus where he said, it's more important to get and uphold the Black vote for the Democrats than hold on to the white Dixiecrats of the South for the political future. And is it a shame and kind of gross that that's why this legislation got passed? I think so. But at the same time, that's kind of how it seems to work from the ways that I've been thinking about it. And I am absolutely not an expert. please don't take my word for it if you don't think I'm right. I would love to talk with anybody who thinks I'm wrong. I love, like, please challenge me. That's my favorite thing. Like, let's talk about it. It's how we learn the most. But yeah, these are kind of just my thoughts.
Okay. We will definitely bring you back, Ian, and there will be
I'll come back anytime.
different challenges, but it's 5:32. So thank you for speaking to us about Sunrise and its movement building to push forward a Green New Deal. Importantly, that incorporates the tenets of that Red Deal, right? I think that was very, very powerful to see. And also thank you to all that are listening for sharing a space and intention to build and sustain solidarity across collective liberation, right? Because this is the only way that we are going to be able to resolve not only the climate crisis, but you know, all of the other social and economic crises that we are facing today. So again, thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, everybody. Come hang, come join Sunrise for a good time. We're all pretty nice. Thank you so much.